So in this video, I give you an overview of the two key readings for topic 3, which is about how people form their sense of inequality. And the two readings are Ragnarsdóttir, Bernburg and Ólafsdóttir, Icelandic authors, looking at the global financial crisis and individual distress after the collapse of the Icelandic economy. The second reading is Sarah Irwin, looking at lay perceptions of inequality and social structure in Britain. So why are these the key readings? What's the point of giving you these readings? Well, both of them look at how economic crisis, when people experience a significant worsening of their financial situation and economic prospects, how that affects people's sense of inequality and their sense of grievance or anger about it. And both the readings argue that there is a complicated relationship between changing economic conditions and people's feelings of anger and injustice, where what they feel about inequality is related to their comparative sense of their practical situation and what they think can be done to change it. So Ragnarsdóttir and colleagues look at Iceland after the 2011 economic crash. They argue people form a sense of inequality from social comparisons to other people or to early points or future points in time. So comparisons about how they feel situated compared to people they see in their neighbourhoods, networks or workplaces, to themselves or their family at earlier points of time, to the groups they think they should be doing better than, to their expected future outcomes. But they also argue that all of this is also affected by how the media and politicians, how such discourses define the main social problems in a given social context and perhaps channel people's concerns and anger. Sarah Irwin looked at Britain's sense of inequality after the 2011 economic crash and the introduction of sweeping austerity policies in Britain. And she argues ordinary people have a pretty good understanding of structural inequality, but she argues that their sense of inequality is also strongly shaped by their practical focus on those aspects of social arrangements, their own social arrangements, that they feel can be changed. So she says while people are aware of structural inequality and how this shapes their own situation, they tend to see most aspects of it as given, as something they can't do much about. And she highlights the complexity of people's understanding of their own social position and the factors affecting their views on wider inequality. So she suggests that individuals possess a pretty nuanced awareness of social processes, much more nuanced than many social analysts suggest. But she argues that that is very practically focused on what they can do in their own lives, and that then kind of narrows and limits it in some ways. Now, they're both thinking about economic crisis, economic crash, austerity cuts, and so on. And you might want to think about how these readings are relevant for thinking about the contemporary period when there is a major cost of living crisis, not only in Britain, but also in many countries across the world. So let's consider the Icelandic case. The 2008 to 2009 economic crisis, it was a global economic crisis, but it hit Iceland particularly hard because it came after a period of sustained growth and affluence. Now, quite a lot of that affluence was based on debt and the encouragement of debt, but nonetheless, there had been considerable affluence. In the crisis, the country's banking system collapsed, the economy plunged into recession, and there was also a very significant decline in public trust in the politicians who had overseen what was seen as a financial bubble. Yet the effect on Icelandic people's sense of relative deprivation or injustice was, according to this study, surprisingly muted. Actually, there are a series of studies, and not just this one, which found that whilst most people felt there had been a reduction in their standard of living, this only had modest overall effects on people's sense of subjective injustice and no overall effect on their anger. This is based on survey data. So why didn't people feel angry or feel that something unjust had happened? So Ragnarsdóttir and colleagues argue that people's sense of anger and injustice was modified and muted by their comparisons to others, by their evaluation of whether the crisis had harmed them more than others, as well as to their expected future prospects, whether they thought things might improve relatively soon. Now, there was a greater sense of injustice and anger among those who had negative expectations for the future, but no effect on those who had positive expectations. Those who felt the crisis had harmed them more than others also felt greater injustice and anger. But Ragnarsdóttir and colleagues argue that most Icelandic people seem to feel that they were, in their phrase, all in the same boat, that people have been equally affected by the crash. And they've got a lovely quote here. When there is a widespread perception that most people have been hit hard by a crisis, most individuals tend to accept their economic loss because they think that others have been hit at least just as badly. So they say, ironically, a widespread perception of despair creates a social context where even a large drop in the standard of living has only a small effect on individual distress. Now, this research shows that people's sense of inequality is framed by their social location and the changing social conditions that they experience, but in a complicated manner. And we can see a parallel argument in Irwin's study of subjective inequality among British people in the depths of recession after the 2008 global economic crisis in Britain. So Irwin's research examines how people perceive social structures and economic disparities, particularly in the context of the growing inequalities in Britain since the 1980s, which were particularly experienced severely after the financial crash of 2008. Now, her study is a qualitative study to explore what she calls lay perception, ordinary people's perceptions, as opposed to sociologists' perceptions of social inequality, and their sense of their self-positioning within a social structure. And the sample included individuals from various socioeconomic backgrounds to see how different groups might understand their positions differently. Now, her study found a heightened concern about inequality. Her sample referred to the increased cost of living, rising job insecurity, and the least advantaged members of the sample spoke of the quite significant experiences of constraint and hardship. But that was qualified by temporal comparisons to when people were growing up. So while many people said that they were struggling at the time that the study was conducted, nevertheless, they still typically felt better off than their parents at an earlier point in time. And Irwin argues it was not so much that people had a restricted viewpoint. She actually said their parents were pretty keenly aware of wider structural inequalities as well as changing inequality over time. She argues rather that it was that people's understandings of inequality were situated within very practical concerns about how it affected their own situation, and very specifically how that might be managed or improved. So, in contrast to some of the arguments we will explore in this topic and in the previous topic, Owen doesn't really argue that people have a poor or restricted sense of inequality. She says that her sample generally had a pretty good awareness of broader social structures and changes in the structure of opportunity over time. But she says that they perceive their position in society and those changes very practically. So they did relate their experiences to wider structural and economic processes, but their focus was on how they had managed these wider inequalities and sought to make positive changes in their own lives. And they were focused on those aspects of their social location that they felt could be changed, that they could personally do something about. But most structures of inequality were seen well beyond that scope. Their focus on their immediate practical concerns, their jobs, their families, their standard of living, and so on, meant that they took relations of inequality as given, as simply the background environment which they had to negotiate. And here we have a nice quote from Sarah Irwin. So her analysis suggests that people are aware of the extensive inequality present in society and express concerns about social exclusion and unfairness. And that challenged the notion that people fundamentally misperceive inequality. I mean, whether or not they had a sense of the true scale of inequality is not clear, but they had significant concerns about how much inequality they saw, shall we say. So instead of focusing on what individuals don't see, Irwin emphasises what people do focus on and why they focus on it, stressing the context and practical activities that shape their views. She says perceptions appear to be strongly framed by reference to their own material circumstances. When participants evaluated those circumstances, this was very conservatively bounded and closely followed the contours of their own lives. In day-to-day experiences and perceptions, people tend to take the social world in which they move and the configuration of opportunity and constraint as effectively given them. Comparisons appear to be most relevant in referencing very immediate alternative possibilities. So they might compare themselves to siblings in terms of job opportunities and so on, and the choices that people were making or could make, but they weren't really thinking that wider social arrangements they could do much about. They had to manoeuvre within them. So we're going to look at these readings in greater detail in the lecture and workshop, but when you're thinking about these readings, when you're going through them, make certain that you don't use this video as a substitute for actually doing the reading, because there's much more detail and context in the readings which you will need to draw on. But one of the questions you might want to consider is, and think about applying it to the current economic crisis and the kind of rising poverty and falling standards of living in Britain. If widespread economic crisis makes people feel that they are all in the same boat, and so their situation can't easily be changed, what would prompt people's anger or dissent? In the Icelandic case, there was some anger and dissent. And the government fell eventually. What prompted that? And then the other question is, why do most people feel that structures of inequality are beyond their control? How is that connected to how political parties and social movements frame situations, or whether there are social movements that might help people to challenge the problems that they face? And also, how do the media and political discourses affect how people view what can be changed and what can't be changed in the social arrangements that we all must negotiate?